What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity. And guess what? This is the very first episode of the podcast recorded, well, at least the intro, right? In my new office in Edinburgh, Scotland. That's right. I just arrived here. We're getting settled, trying to adjust sleep schedules, and also trying to figure out how to watch the Dodgers in the playoffs when there's an 8-hour difference between where you live and the city of Los Angeles. Nonetheless, today on the podcast is Jonathan Jong, who is a scientist and a minister. He is the research fellow at Coventry University, deputy director of the Brain, Belief, and Behaviour Group. He's a senior researcher at the Institute for Cognitive and Evolutionary Anthropology at Oxford University. He does a lot of work in psychology of religion, philosophical issues connected with the scientific study of religion. He is an associate priest at the parish church of St Mary Magdalen, and overall, he is a brilliant scholar, tons of fun to talk to, and we had ourselves a good old time. So good that this podcast, is longer than a normal one, and we talked for another hour after it. Yeah. So I hope y'all enjoy it as much as I did, and then decide, Trip, can Jonathan come back on? And you tell me that, and I say, I will ask him. And then I talk to him, and he comes back on. Before we hop in, I just want to tell you a few things. One thing is, I'm in Scotland, and a bunch of you have been asking, Trip, are you going to do Theology Beer Camp or something like that in Scotland? The answer is yes. I got to figure out all the details and how that would even be possible and like how that works with this country. But no, enough of you have said I would like to come and theologize with Scotch and visit Scotland. And I was like, let's make that happen. Second, if you are in the UK and the surrounding area or going to be visiting, holler at me. I got to make new friends. If you're in the area and you would like coming when I record some live podcasts, or people that would, holler at me. I'd love to connect. I have some really cool opportunities to do some interviews coming my way. And I got to decide, what's the initial population like here for a live podcast? Like, do I want to get together a small group in an office? Do I want to get a bigger space? Is it safer to try to live stream them? Because people that would want to get together are, more spread out, but in this time zone, I don't know. But, you got to holler at me. And then the last thing is, if you're a Homebrewed Christianity member, you're a member of the Homebrewed community, you went to homebrewedcommunity.com and joined. Thank you a million times. I've been working out a lot of little kinks with what worked automatically and not with all the members in our whole new setup. There's a private podcast feed that I'm about to stick even more surprises and goodies on, because I have all the lectures from the Process Theology Nerd boot camp that I did in Indianapolis, and I have all the lectures from Called to Be Prophets, the event and stuff with Brian McLaren, Steve Davidson, and Robin Henderson Espinoza. There's so many treats I have ready to share. If you want to support the podcast, be a part of the community, go there, including access to the members only if you're an elder or a bishop. And by the way, that just means that you donate. That doesn't mean you're an actual elder or bishop, or it means you're an actual elder or bishop just because you donate each month. Nonetheless, we have a intro to theology class running for those group of people. All right. So I hope you enjoy this. If you're local, reach out. If you want to be a part of the 0.5% of listeners or less that donate each month, go to Homebrewed Community. And enjoy, because I did. And don't forget, share the brew. Well, hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Trip, and I'm in Claremont, California. Where are you, Jonathan?
I'm in Oxford, in England.
In England. And the internet is actually working in my hotel. I never know when you pay extra for the fast internet if they are just taking my money or not.
I suppose you take it by faith.
I know. Well, taking it by faith. So you are both ordained and a scientist, and you're actually engaged in a whole bunch of different research projects. So maybe we could begin by you introducing yourself and how your multi-directional vocation emerged in your life.
Gosh, yeah, all right. So let's wax autobiographical for a moment. I grew up in a fairly non-religious family in quite a religious country, which was Malaysia, so I was a teenager when I became a Christian, and I think I had the kind of personality in which once you became a Christian, you had three options: either become a missionary, a minister, or a monk. And I decided that I should go for the minister route for various reasons, and I sort of put that off for a long time. So I went to university and took up experimental psychology as my major, in part because I thought it might help with pastoral ministry in the future. And it turned out that I was good at experimental psychology on its own terms. So I went to grad school and did that whole thing. Came to Oxford for my postdoc, and by the time I arrived in Oxford, I was well and truly on track for ordination. The bishop in New Zealand decided that I should train for the priesthood, and so I did while I was doing my postdoc, and I was ordained while I was in Oxford as well. And I've been a priest for 5 years now, and so my academic career has mostly been in experimental psychology. So I think of myself mainly as a psychologist. Some people might say cognitive science, in particular because I'm associated with this movement within the social science of religion called the cognitive science of religion. And that's a combination of evolutionary theories of religious belief and behavior and belonging, mixed in with straightforward empirical methods that you might find in psychology, neuroscience, and sociology. So that's what's marked my academic career mostly. I'm a data guy. I collect data from the lab and from field experiments in what you might think of as the real world. I do survey-based research as well. But on the side, I've asked myself and I've asked collaborators to work with me on what you might think of as philosophical and theological questions, the implications of the science of the origins of religious belief and moral reasoning, for example. And I've gotten more and more interested in more metaphysical questions, and this is kind of a part of my journey from being more Protestant to being more Catholic. I think there's a kind of trend in liberal Protestant circles to care a lot about epistemology. It seems my reading of the tradition and of the kind of more recent literature is that at least Roman Catholics and also more Catholically minded Protestants have had more interest in metaphysics, and that's the kind of direction I've been moving in recent years as well.
Mm-hmm. So when you talk about the scientific origins of religion, and someone hears you say that, and at church, and they're like, "Well, obviously, Jonathan, it's God." How do you introduce, as a person of faith, the scientific study of religion, the origins of religion, recognizing that culturally there's this assumption that if you explain something scientifically, the phenomena then has like no correspondent, no referent, no transcendent relation?
Sure. I'm not sure there's one way to talk to any given audience, right? It's all sort of context dependent. I sometimes use the old Herbert McCabe quip. So Herbert McCabe was a Dominican at Oxford. He was a great philosopher. Didn't publish very much when he was alive, but since his death, Brian Davies, his colleague, has been accumulating material and publishing the stuff posthumously. So Herbert used to say that, look, Christians never ask what makes the kettle boil. Is it the fire or God? Right. So there's a kind of intuition that we have at the level of mundane things that mechanistic explanations that invoke material things in the world are not inconsistent with a notion that God acts in the world, keeping it in existence in all times and at all places. So I think people generally have this intuition when it comes to mundane things. We don't think there's any competition in saying, look, at some level, obviously God keeps kettles in existence and fire in existence, etc. But we would never want to say, well, that theological account somehow undermines the account in which the fire is the thing that keeps the kettle that makes the kettle boil, and vice versa. So I think that's one way I might do this kind of thing. The other thing I often say is, look, like we're perfectly happy with the idea that God appears to Abraham, or that the angel Jibril appears to Muhammad. But we would like to know how it is that Abraham can receive this revelation. What is it about Abraham's mind? What is it about Muhammad's mind that allows them to recognize revelation as such? Mm-hmm. How can God speak to us given what's true about our brains, what's true about our minds? So the other way of thinking about this, if you are a Protestant, is to ask Calvin's question, right? So Calvin's proposition is that God accommodates to us, right? And we want to know, cognitive scientists, evolutionary psychologists want to know about the us part of this, right? Divine communication has to be, as it were, a two-way process. There is the divine part, and then there's the human part. And our questions are all about the human part.
Mm-hmm. And so when you look at the cosmic history, and then even just the history of life on this planet, like, how do you understand the late arrival of religion? Well, I think that by religion we mean a very specific phenomenon, right? We mean a collection of a sort of mix of belonging, believing, and behaving, right? So when it comes to believing, we mean things like the belief in what some people think of as supernatural agents, right? Gods, angels, demons, etc. A soul might count in this category. And then there are also concomitant moral beliefs, often attached to religious traditions. By behaving, we mainly refer to rituals, but we also can refer to moral behavior, at least in the venerable moral religious traditions. And by belonging, we mean something like a religious community, like a church or denomination, something like this. And therefore, there's a sense in which the late arrival of religion is a matter of definition, right? Once you've defined religion in more or less organized fashion, in the way that I've just done, there's a sense in which we've kind of defined ourselves into a corner, right? There are a bunch of organisms that just are not capable of one or more of these things, for example. But that's not to say that there's nothing that a theologian would recognize as worship, right? So I know we these days we find it very odd for people like, say, Kepler or Nicholas of Cusa to talk about, the universe singing to God, right? So Kepler had this thing about the harmony of the universe. Mm-hmm. We find that kind of language very odd now, right, yeah. So these days I think we find that kind of language, the kind of language that Kepler and Nicholas of Cusa would have been comfortable with, a bit strange, right? And also we don't know what to do with bits of the Psalms about creation, about creation itself praising God. We don't really know what to do with the things that Jesus says about the stones crying aloud if the people did not. And I think that's, on one hand, fine. Maybe all these things should be read metaphorically. On the other hand, there's a sense in which it's on us that we have this sort of limited sense of what religion is, a limited sense of what worship, what creation's worship might look like. And if you take a more expansive view of what religion is, then the question then loses its premise, where then it's not the case that religion is new. And so it all kind of depends on what it is that we're willing to treat of as religion. And I think that's a question that is a theological one, right? I think theologians shouldn't outsource the job of definition to social scientists. And so if you have a theological question to ask about the relation between time and creation and worship, then you got to work out what the terms mean as a theologian, qua theologian, as opposed to saying, well, here's what social scientists mean by religion, and oh, look how late it comes. Now let's ask theological questions about that, having already handed the premise to some other discipline. Mm-hmm. It's an odd thing to do.
Yeah, but I think it represents a tendency among religious scholars to really feel unsure about what it is they're talking about, right? Like there's a lot of theologians who, if you ask them the question, who is God, they have to, one, reframe the whole question to finally get around to epistemological terms they feel comfortable talking. And then they locate themselves. And then in advance will apologize should their definition come across, too confident and that kind of thing. So when you're dealing with like scholars in religious traditions, talking with scientists, I think part of the difficulty is that we haven't learned how to use declarative sentences while talking from within our traditions in a public square today. It's like when theologians used to do that, it came with a type of cultural privilege that we see problematic. So we haven't rediscovered a type of confidence and permission to do so.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I don't want to say that there shouldn't be intellectual humility, right, among theologians or philosophers or scientists. I think a dose of navel gazing and self-doubt, I mean, all that is very healthy. But I think we make the mistake if we think that the destruction, the deconstruction, if you like, of Christian hegemony entails that Christians can no longer speak like Christians, right? It seems to me that the kind of dethroning of Christian theology just means that we have to recognize more conversation partners. It is not to say that we can no longer speak as ourselves. Mm-hmm. It's not the case that the acknowledgement that there are interesting Buddhist voices and Muslim voices and secular voices, it's not at all to diminish the validity of Christian voices, I think. And I think once we're tempted to think that it's a zero-sum game, that conversation is a zero-sum game, then we run into trouble very quickly.
Mm-hmm. So when you look at the field of cognitive science of religion and are trying to kind of give people a framework for thinking about it that are new to it, like how do you introduce the different theories of religion, or kind of the shaping or centering questions for, because there's a lot of people listening to podcasts that love philosophy, love theology, love studying religion and such, and cognitive science isn't something that's come up quite a bit.
Right. I think I begin with a question that we're asking, which is, where does religion come from? And we can answer this question. You can ask and answer this question in a variety of ways. You can ask the question historically. You can ask the question paleoanthropologically. You can ask the question developmentally within a lifetime. You can ask the question neuroscientifically in terms of the mechanisms in your brain. And what we do as cognitive scientists of religion is to then circumscribe the factors that we're looking at. So we're interested in the neuroscientific approach. We're interested in the developmental psychological approach. We're interested in measurable historical and cultural variables, that the kinds of variables that economists and sociologists might deal with. We're interested in cognitive mechanisms in terms of not how just the brain works in terms of neurotransmitters and hormones, but also how information is processed at a more abstract level, right? Once you get away from the meat and juices, and so we're for example usually not historians of the traditional kind, right? And so what we do is then we in our various sub-disciplines. So I'm not an evolutionary biologist. I'm not a behavioral economist. I'm not equipped to do that part of the work. I'm equipped to do the experimental psychological part of the work, the cognitive science part of the work. And so I ask questions like, okay, so are there motivations that lead people to be more or less religious? So that's the kind of level of analysis that I'm getting at. And all of us who are engaged in the cognitive science of religion are in our little disciplinary pots, our porous disciplinary pots, asking quite circumscribed questions. And occasionally, we will either get together or step back and read the breadth of the literature and do some theorizing. We're trying to put together the work that developmental psychologists do about how children reason about the world. And we're putting that together with evolutionary theories about how human beings developed our our tendencies and affinities for learning socially, for example. And we're going to put that together with experimental psychological work on the effects that certain kinds of anxieties have on either coalitional thinking, so like affiliation to groups on one hand, or superstitious and supernatural beliefs on the other. And so that work is synthetic, right? The theoretical work is synthetic and draws from multiple empirical disciplines, but the empirical work itself is quite circumscribed. Some might say reductionist, and I think that's fair, right? So what we've done is we've taken a quite complicated phenomenon, religion, with its constituent parts, believing, belonging, behaving, and try to ask very specific questions about these various aspects, and then the putting together of all this information comes later and comes periodically.
Mm-hmm. So when in CSR, when people talk about religion as either part of evolutionary adaptation and its origin is there, or as a spandrel, what's the debate that's taking place?
Right. So there are two basic sort of big theories, or there are two approaches to thinking about the evolution of religion. The first is to ask whether or not religion itself, or more accurately, some proper part of religion, some important aspect of religion, whether or not it or they have some kind of evolutionary function. So that's one way of approaching questions about religion from an evolutionary perspective. The other broad way of thinking about evolution and religion, or the evolution of religion, is to consider how the human mind has evolved over time more broadly. So we say we know some things about the environment in which our hominid ancestors lived and evolved, and we come up with these theories about what sorts of cognitive tools, what kinds of psychological abilities and tendencies were important for that kind of environment for human beings to thrive. And we can think about those tools and ask questions like, how do those tools contribute to the formation and transmission of religious beliefs? And these can be things like our social tendencies, right, or our abilities to interact socially with other humans and non-human agents, or they can be even more basic. They can be things like, how does the human memory system or systems work, for example?
Mm-hmm.
And we can ask, well, how do memory systems relate to religious transmission? We can ask questions like, how do social cognitive abilities, how do our social tendencies relate to how we think about gods? And that all that can be true, while it also being the case that the package of things that end up being religion also has some kind of evolutionary benefit for either individual people who hold these beliefs and have these tendencies, or for groups. And there are all kinds of debates between evolutionary theorists about whether or not group level analyses of evolutionary histories are useful or add anything to individual or gene level analyses. So those are the kind of two broad ways of thinking about the evolution of religion. They're not necessarily mutually inconsistent.
Mm-hmm. That's helpful. So, what is the connection you see between religion and culture in general, and what role culture, or the things humans do together, how that impacts the trajectory of the species?
Yeah, I think in some ways it's best to get away from something as hot and sexy as religion, and let's think about something more mundane, right? Let's think about say language. Like, not to piss on linguists, but
it's okay.
Language is easier in some ways. So I think most people think that the ability and tendency to speak and listen, in particular, to stimuli that you might think of as linguistic, is an evolutionary adaptation, right? There are lots of things that are required that are not that language is built on lots of other things like our memory systems, etc. But let's say we can agree that the ability to communicate linguistically is an evolutionary adaptation, and so that's in the kind of straightforwardly cognitive realm, right? So then the question is, well, what role does culture play in language? And the answer is sort of obvious, right? So even if the tendency to an ability to speak and listen to what we might call linguistic stimuli, even if that is pan-cultural, even if that's universal, evolved, etc., innate, you might say, it's still the case that the actual stimuli that actual human beings encounter is culturally determined, culturally shaped. I think determined is not too strong a word here, actually. Is that there are very, very few sounds that eventually become linguistic markers that are part of our biological endowment. Most sounds most of the semantic attachments to sounds are arbitrary, right? With very, very few exceptions. So there's obviously sort of cultural input to the way we actually speak and listen, and eventually the way we write and read. So there, what you have is you have an evolved cognitive predisposition and ability, which is then largely shaped by culture and history. And religion is the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
So even if we thought that there were a slew of cognitive tendencies and abilities, such as the tendency to infer agentic causation in the world, right? So you hear the wind or a rustling bush, and our intuition is to attribute the cause of this movement to an agent, which is to say a thing with volition and mind and will, etc. Let's say that's an evolved capacity, right? This tendency to attribute agency to things is an evolved capacity. That tendency has to encounter ideas, has to encounter cultural ideas before it becomes what we might recognize as religion. Now, there's always going to be the question, well, who invents the first God? But that's like asking the question, who invents the first word, right? Like there's a sense in which this is not an answerable question, but it's that people begin pointing at objects and making sounds, and then these things get associated together. And in the same way, people can point at say their leaders or their spouses or whatever, right? Or their elders, and draw intuitive analogies between human agents and what eventually become gods. Which is why probably it's not surprising that across cultures and across history, the gods have almost always been anthropomorphized.
Yeah. So when you think of just an individual being born, the culture they're born in, with the language, what stories they tell, and all that kind of stuff, is giving them an inheritance that's much bigger than just their genetic one. And it is shaping the way they, or how would a cognitive scientist put it? Does it shape the way you experience religious phenomena? Does it, like if we were born in a different part of in a different part of our world, we would be having a different religious background to, say our theological reflections. If we were born at a different point in history, there would be different things available. Like, how does a cognitive scientist see distinctions between those kind of, I don't know if you'd put like innate religious desires or, that kind of like how Paul Bloom talks about, like Descartes' babies all have this this intuitive dualism and anthropomorphic supernatural deity kind of thing. How do you see the difference between those innate, those kind of like hardware desires for the ultimate of some sort, and the evolving, ever-changing, born into, embedded thematizing of it at the level of culture?
Right. So I think the best way to think about this is to consider constraints on one hand and catchiness on the other. Right. So let's go back to the linguistic analogy. If you think that our capacity for a language is an evolved one, then that entails various things, including a more or less limited view of what counts as linguistic stimuli, right? Mm-hmm. And so what that further entails is that some languages are impossible. Some like artificial constructed languages are impossible for humans to learn, right? Because they just violate the rules that govern the evolved capacity to pick up language. Some things just don't count as linguistic stimuli, right? So that's the constraint part. And then the catchiness part is that given our cognitive tendencies, it's going to be the case that certain kinds of linguistic stimuli are going to be more, let's say, attractive to the human mind, right? So you can, for example, see, like humans seem to like rhyming, right? Like who knows why, right? But that's catchy, and it's catchy in at least in part because of the ways our minds have evolved. If you want to take an even more kind of like simple perceptual analogy, you can think about vision, right? So our visual systems evolved so that we can see a spectrum of colors, but there's so much electromagnetic stimulation in the universe that we're totally blind to, right? We can't see things in the UV spectrum. We can't see things in the infrared spectrum and below it, and that's just a matter of constraint. On the other hand, right, there are facts about our visual system that make certain things catchy. So color contrasts are catchy to us, for example. And then you have people who exploit our visual tendencies by constructing visual illusions that are really, really catchy to us, right? And that's more or less universal, right? So you have these constraints and you have these sort of like areas of catchiness, and that which is true for vision and for language is also more or less true for religion. There's some things that are there's some gods that are just not going to catch on, even if we could imagine them, even if we can tell stories about them, and that's going to be determined by these basic evolved cognitive traits that we all have. And then there's some things that are just going to be catchy, right? So there are lots of things there are lots of gods that are possible. There are lots of rituals that are possible. There are lots of configurations of religious organizations that are going to be possible. But some of them are going to be catchy. And so I think what the cognitive scientists would say is to say, look, not all the facts about the histories of religious traditions around the world are purely historically contingent. Right? Some of it is constrained and shaped by our basic cognitive tendencies. So what we're looking for when we read the histories of religions around the world is to find similarities. Right? There are lots of very interesting differences around the world of what people believe about their gods and about the afterlife and about how their religious organizations are structured. But there are also lots of interesting similarities. And to the extent that there are differences, we also like to be able to explain them, to see whether or not there are social or physical or cultural factors that push our basic cognitive tendencies in one direction or the other to produce the religious manifestation that we in fact find. So, okay, let's take a more concrete example. You might think of reincarnation or of pre-mortal existence. You might think of physical resurrection or the immortality of the soul. Right, and these are all different accounts of the relationship between one's mortal life and one's, let's say, essence. What all these things seem to differ on is that there's a kind of separation between two parts of what you may think of as yourself, right? And the language over what the parts are called, right? Body and soul, mind and body, spirit and body, whatever. And it doesn't matter how many of these things you have, right? You might be spirit, soul, and body, etc. You might have 7 souls. The point is that what cognitive scientists recognize is, look, there's some kind of distinguishing between parts, metaphysical parts going on, right? And some of them are more or less material, and some of them are more or less kind of less than material or different from material. And that's where we get interested. That's where we start asking questions. Wait a second. How early do children draw distinctions between their bodies and some other part of themselves? And we can ask, like, does everyone do this around the world? So we can, for example, run like cute studies on children. Right. So one of my favorite studies of all time is by a psychologist called Bruce Hood, who worked with Paul Bloom, whom you mentioned. And what this team of psychologists did was they showed 5 or 6 year old kids a machine, and they showed the kids like a blue brick, and they put the blue brick in the machine, and the machine got turned on, and they open the machine up, and then there are two identical blue bricks. So the children understand that what the machine does is physical duplication. So then they show the children a hamster, and they tell the children that the hamster is quite an unusual hamster. The hamster has a blue heart. The hamster earlier swallowed a marble, and in so doing chipped a tooth at the back of its mouth, which you can't see. But it's true, right? The hamster has a broken tooth and has a blue heart and has a marble in its belly. And then they get the kids to whisper their names to the hamster, to show the hamster a drawing that the child had done. They told each child to tickle the hamster, etc. And then they put the hamster in the machine, and then they duplicate the hamster. So now you have two hamsters, the original hamster and the duplicate. And they ask the children, considering the duplicate, does the duplicate have a blue heart and a marble in its belly and a broken tooth? And does the hamster remember your name? Does it remember you tickling it? Does it remember the drawing that you showed it earlier? And they can show that children, right, age 5 and 6, draw a distinction there between physical traits and psychological traits. And that's sort of interesting, right? That tells us that this tendency is at least as early as 5, and maybe the next step should be to run the study on 2-year-olds or something like this. And then we can take that study and run it around the world to see whether or not that gap between physical traits being duplicable and psychological traits being duplicable is a thing that happens in all places that we can get a sample in. And to the extent to which that's true, that gives us some handle on basic psychological intuitions that are then shaped by their cultures, which elaborate on those intuitions to form what you might think of as a metaphysics of the person or the metaphysics of an afterlife, right? So the details of the metaphysics of persons and of afterlife are where culture comes in. But what makes any of that possible or attractive are the basic cognitive dispositions to draw distinctions between body and non-body within the human person.
Mm-hmm. And so in the discipline, how does kind of awareness that that's the case enable people on each side to argue for then, the reality that these structures, correspond to, or that these structures demonstrate the falsity of there being a ultimate reality?
There have always been and always will be people who try to take the psychological theories and draw metaphysical conclusions from them, either positive or negative. I mean, this has been true at least since William James, right? I mean, even before William James. I mean, William James writes The Varieties of Religious Experience in the early 1900s, and even there, he's already addressing some of his colleagues and friends who assume that clinical neurological explanations of religious experiences are sufficient to debunk the veracity of religious experiences. This has always happened, and in some ways, there are any number of citations that you can provide before William James. So David Hume does this too, to some extent. Even Xenophanes and Lucretius do this in ages and ages ago. So this tendency has always been around. At the same time, theistic thinkers have also wanted to use the naturalness of religious ideas, the kind of the almost sheer obviousness of theism, or the universality of consensus about there being gods. People have wanted to use that as an argument for theism as well, and this has been true for hundreds of years. None of this seems to be particularly fruitful. It's not clear to me that any of the arguments are valid. It's not clear to me that you can draw metaphysical conclusions from these kinds of facts about humans. And the reason is because, as I said at the beginning of our talk together, that there are two parts to religion. There is the part about the gods, and then there's the part about the humans. And social scientists and natural scientists about religion are really only working on the human part, because we have no access to the God part, right? We don't get to give God a survey. We don't get to put God in an fMRI machine. And so we have, strictly speaking, nothing to say about any of this.
Well, so one of the things that, and you mentioned it in an article of yours about how, a classical notion of divine simplicity problematizes that move. Is it?
You mean the move from the science to the metaphysics?
Yeah.
Yeah. So here's the way I think about Christian theism, Christian theism's relationship to this science in particular. I can really only speak from my own tradition. I don't really know what say a Buddhist would make of any of this, or for example, even what a deist would make of any of this. But the cognitive science of religion is interested in explaining certain phenomena, and the phenomena they try to explain are for example the gods in their more or less anthropomorphized form, right?
Mm-hmm.
And which is pervasive, right? Like most Christians, most of the time, even the most well-educated, theologically literate Christians, when the cognitive load is high, are like heretical anthropomorphizers, myself included, right? So let's not pretend that isn't true. However, there are resources within the Christian tradition to criticize this tendency that we have to anthropomorphize God. And therefore, there is a kind of theologically correct answer to the question, what is God? And perhaps even what is God like? And so to the extent that that's true, you can ask the question, well, okay, is the kind of thing that the cognitive science of religion seeks to explain the belief of, the kind of thing that Christian theologians have established as the theologically correct view of Christians? And in that paper, I tried to argue no, right? So trying to argue from CSR toward or away from Christian theism is making a mistake about what Christian theism entails. We just have different reference.
Mm-hmm.
When we're talking about God or gods, when we're going back and forth between CSR and Christian theology.
Well, so one of the questions that comes to mind, and I don't really have much clue as to how exactly I would answer it, but when you differentiate the God part and the human part in this engagement, and that CSR is looking at the human part, how does the Jewish and Christian testimony to a God who is invested in history, relates to history, and even in, I don't know if I'd footnote Calvin, but there is a sense that God's coming to the people of Israel in the life of the church and such involves an accommodation to the understanding, situation, and history of Israel. Like how does God's revelation, being a historically situated one in the history of Israel and life of the church, lead you to interpret maybe like the cultural observations or transformations in religious traditions? Like, is there a sense in which, if God is the invested, accommodating one to a people and a history, that the transformations of culture in some sense are the fruit of God and the world in relation? Or how would you ask that question?
Right. I think that Christians, and I think you're right that it's true for our Jewish cousins as well, have to have some account of God's acting in the world, even if by that we don't necessarily mean miracles of the sort of spectacular kind. Even if by that we just mean God relating to a people, necessarily situated in times and places. I think that there are ways to do this that remain at the level of metaphysics, and therefore the discourse is different from that of generating empirical predictions about exactly how histories turn out. right? I think there are ways to do this at the level of, for example, to think of like relations as a metaphysical category, right? And that is more or less independent from empirical observations. And then on the other end, I think that there's always going to be room for like the interpretation of facts, historical or otherwise, right? So the question of whether or not we should interpret any given thing as an act of revelation or any given thing as an act of divine providence, it seems to me that question has no predictive empirical content. Like that's a hermeneutical move. So it's not clear to me that the sciences have very much to say about that either.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, why I ask is I think there is a, like, for example, when Dan Dennett was here, was on campus when I was a student, he kind of assumed that, if you're genuinely religious, this is what you really believe, right? And or will point to the history, the testimony of ancient Mesopotamian Jewish people, and then be like, well, that's obviously crazy or whatever. And I remember a rabbi that was here for the dinner. He said, the passages you point out in our text that you think are embarrassing and disqualifying are the same ones that we preserve because they show us when we look back at them with embarrassment or wrestle with them or frustration, they show us that God didn't leave us alone when we were stuck with that, that picture of God, and that the history of the people of Israel, the texts are sacred, but the conclusions are open to God's ongoing, relationship and history. And I don't think he understood what. I don't think Dennett comprehended it, but I do realize that was one of those times where I realized how the way you frame and interpret a religious tradition, prior to engaging in kind of the scientific assessment of it makes a really big deal. And you had mentioned it earlier.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think there are two ways to think about this. One is the very straightforward question of genre, right? Like what genre do we fit a text into that leads to all kinds of interpretive rules for us, right? And then it's, by the sounds of it, Daniel Dennett has decided to interpret various texts more or less as history or as proto-science, and therefore reads in a particular way and comes to a particular evaluation. But that's fine, right? So I think the point about genre is one that has been made to death. But there is, I think, another way to think about religious traditions or religious texts in particular, where the Jewish tradition has done a much better job than the Christian traditions have done, which is think about texts and traditions as precisely the locus of interpretation. So the Jews have always been much better at not being fixed to particular ways of interpreting texts, right? They have a tradition of responding to one another over time, and it's in the series of disagreeing with one another over time. It's in the entire series that you find the faith, right? Not in any given proposition, or not in any given particular interpretation of any given particular text. And so what happens then is the texts and the traditions surrounding the texts become the place where we meet. And what it means to be Jewish, for example, would be precisely to engage with these texts, regardless of where you come out in terms of a conclusion. And I think Christians could do really well to pay attention to this manner of thinking about our faith and our tradition. That the Bible and all it contains, and our ecumenical creeds and all that they contain, are starting points, that they are our table where we meet to have our conversation. And what it means to be a Christian is not to believe any particular thing about any particular part of the creed or the book of Leviticus, but it is the turning up to the table and having that conversation, participating in a conversation about these things that we consider authoritative, by which we mean the subjects of our continuing conversation, our interpreting and reinterpreting, agreeing and disagreeing with one another. It is, as it were, like being a literary people, right? Like being a people of God is to engage in this kind of engagement with this particular form of literature. I think that's not a bad way to think about what it means to be a member of a tradition. It's not just to sign up to particular beliefs, but it's to sign up to ask particular questions of particular texts. And to some extent, we're more than comfortable thinking about this when we think about what it means to be a philosopher, for example, right? We don't mean, well, to be a philosopher, you have to be, a substance dualist and an idealist. No one thinks that, right? Like it's, you're a philosopher if you ask these questions and you participate in the conversation, if you engage in dialogue with this particular tradition or those particular traditions of philosophers. And I think, like we do well to think about Christian tradition in that kind of way too.
And we still make everyone read Descartes, even though right after you finish reading him an intro, everyone's going to complain about him the rest of the time you're in grad school.
Right. Absolutely.
So when you there emphasize the textual element and, in a sense, religious community as a community that's engaged in a hermeneutical act, how would you see things like rituals, connecting to the centering place like text?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I will want to say that the way we read is not totally absent of ritual either.
Right.
So, if you are a Protestant, you read the Bible in a particular way, and by that I don't mean hermeneutically, I mean behaviorally. So, for example, you might read it silently with your eyeballs in your bedroom or something like this, right? So the very classic kind of way that Protestants read the Bible. If you're on the sort of Catholic
Jonathan, I just want you to know that that's not true for as many Protestants as you'd imagine. We just all say we do.
Absolutely, sure.
I have found out that now personally, I didn't know that you could, because I'm a Baptist preacher's kid. I didn't know that you could go to bed without reading the Bible and praying by yourself. And so, even when I was an atheist, I kept doing it. That's how Baptist. I was more Baptist than Christian for a long time, and so I'm regularly surprised when I make references to Scripture and Protestants don't know that I'm quoting the Bible.
Absolutely. So I belong to the Church of England, which is supposed to be a Protestant denomination, but I belong to a very Catholic end of Anglicanism, which is extremely capacious tradition, and I occasionally have my more evangelical friends turn up to services, and it has to be pointed out to them that lots of the service is biblical, and the fact that they don't recognize it off the bat suggests to me that they don't know their Bibles as well as they think they do. Yes, which comes to my point about the Catholic end of the spectrum. So if you're a kind of Christian in a liturgical tradition, then your ritual of reading the Bible, as it were, is to listen. We might do less of the reading the Bible in our bedrooms with our eyeballs, and much more of the hearing of Scripture being read aloud to us, or of ourselves reading Scripture aloud to ourselves and others. And so I think the distinction between ritual and Scripture should not be exaggerated. I think that the manner in which we read religious text, scriptural text, are surrounded by convention and ritual as well. And therefore, I think I have exactly the same thing to say about ritual as I do about Scripture, which is that part of what it means to be a Christian is to participate in certain symbolic acts, and chiefly around the world and across denominations, we have agreed that things like baptism and the celebration of the Eucharist or Holy Communion or the Lord's Supper or the Mass are central acts in which Christians, to be Christians and as Christians, participate. And then there are other things that we might do, right? We might ordain people, we might marry people, we might conduct funerals in a particular way, and these have different statuses in different denominations. But this idea that we are participating in something that we're not just making up on the spot for right now, but has a kind of has a history not just a history of what it looks like, but history of interpretation itself, the interpretation of the behaviors themselves. I think that is of one piece with what I have to say about our history of interpreting scripture, the tradition of interpreting scripture. These are all things that are handed down, which is where we get the word tradition from, traditio. We hand down texts, and some of these are written and some of these are spoken out loud. We hand down movements, etc. We hand down interpretations of both texts and movements, and all that makes up a religious tradition.
And so when you think of our kind of contemporary predicament where culturally people are more and more, well, I'll put it this way, when Christianity isn't the assumed background to someone's life in the West, then the religious practices and rituals and all that kind of stuff have to do a lot more than they used to for most of Christendom. So how do you think of, or how does your scientific research in the nature of religion change the way you think religious community should center itself or practice itself if you were wanting to actually embed people in the wisdom of a tradition? Both adults that maybe are interested in spirituality and such and haven't been before, or families that want their kids to actually experience the depth of a religious tradition and not just, survive till they get through confirmation.
Right. So I think first I'm going to push back on the premise. Right.
All right.
So it's true that it looks like, Christianity is in decline in the West. Right. And that assumes some like great golden age where everyone was not just Christian, but like biblically and theologically literate. And to some extent, of course, that's true, right? To some extent, of course, it's true that once upon a time, many more people went to church regularly and many more people knew their Bible stories, etc. It's not clear to me that it's ever been true that the vast majority of people who have been church-going Christians and even biblically literate Christians have also been quite like theologically thoughtful and literate Christians. Like that is not clear to me at all. That's true, right? I mean, you hear stories about the Middle Ages, with theologians having to explain to lay people and even to priests that some of their beliefs are completely like superstitious and heretical. I think it's a kind of fiction that there's ever been this golden age when everyone believes all these like robust theological principles. I mean, like it's not. I don't think that's true. And there's a sense in which I think what we're seeing in the 21st century is the kind of decay of nominal Christianity. I don't care for nominal Christianity. Right? I'm not that. I grew up in a non-Christian country. I grew up in a non-Christian family. I've never lived in a Christian majority country, really. And so it's not something that I yearn. It's not something that I think is a particularly desirable phenomenon. I mean, as far as I can tell, the church went into decline as soon as Constantine, made it legal and Theodosius mandated Christianity in the realm. So I'm not nostalgic for an alleged golden age in which everybody was Christian. So that's me pushing back against the premise, both of the kind of facticity of a time in which people did believe all the quote unquote right things, or for the desirability of that state of affairs, even if that were imaginary. But let's take the practical question more seriously, right? Which is, what can we learn from cognitive psychology about how to catechize people properly? I think the first lesson is that it's going to be hard, because if we've learned anything from the cognitive science of religion, it's that the religious ideas that are catchy are ideas that Christians have almost always thought of as heretical. So roughly speaking, anthropomorphic and magical beliefs, right? Across at least the intellectual golden periods of the Christian faith, and if you ask me, it's the patristic period and bits of the medieval golden age. These are the sorts of things that CSR posits as being very catchy are things that would horrify Augustine and Aquinas. So that's the first thing. Right? I think that what the psychological research tells us, that this is really deeply ingrained. And if you're interested in disabusing people from their superstitions and their anthropomorphic tendencies, you've got like a long and difficult road ahead of you. And to the extent that a lot of the work that's been done has been done on children, a lot of the most interesting research on CSR is developmental psychological research. I think you can look at the way children reason about why the natural world is the way it is. The intuitions about the fact about whether or not it's designed, for example. You can think about that as one category of interesting information from which to draw in terms of designing like curricula for children, about teaching children about the doctrine of creation, for example. There are things to watch out for there. And then also there's a lot of work now on how children reason about religious entities on one hand, and other imaginary entities, or entities that you may think of as imaginary, like, the Tooth Fairy or Santa Claus or the Loch Ness Monster, etc. And I think that might give parents and catechists of children pause about how we treat these different kinds of entities. So for example, it's really interesting. There's a bit of folk wisdom among developmental psychologists, which is borne out in the data that they have, which is not tremendous amounts of data, but there's some evidence for this intuition. Developmental psychologists like to point out that we never say things like cats are real to our children, right? We never declare that X is real when X is in fact real, right? We only really ever say that something is real when it's not real. Like we trick our children into thinking that, for example, Santa Claus is real, right? In that sense, reality as a linguistic marker, at some point children pick up that if you have to assert that something is real, if an adult has to assert that something is real, like you should probably doubt the assertion. And so we might therefore want to learn how to talk about God in that way, right? Instead of asserting that God is real. Perhaps what we might want to do is to behave as if God is real, right? And children might pick that up a lot more readily, right? That our behaviors are what psychologists call credibility enhancing displays.
I mean, as a minister, my wife and I are both ministers, and for a long time, I wrestled with how to respond to my oldest son's questions, and the way in which he picked up what God meant, was so much connected to folk religion. I just started telling him what I really thought. And he's a real smart, he's in 5th grade now. And the other day he is talking to his friends, and they're both, they said they're both atheists. They're like, oh, well, we don't believe there's a guy on a cloud. And Elton's like, oh, Christians don't either. Predicating existence to God is problematic because God is infinite. And
great.
And he's like, that's heresy. And they're like, what? And what's interesting is what you were saying, like thinking back to it, is like they had never even thought about the idea of something that has no beginning nor ending by definition. And so whatever they were talking about when they were talking about God was, definitionally not the one monotheists tend to talk about.
Right.
But it's also striking to me how much of the church, now that like physical text and literacy and availability of science and all this kind of stuff is available more and more, how we let these folk accounts of God linger in our congregations, and then people, by simply recognizing that a lot of the church practices idolatry, leave it. And they're like, well, the source of existence can't be this nice grandpa in the sky with a trident, or the slightly more sophisticated version. And so I think that part of our cultural situation is such that you can't leave when you think of spiritual education and formation, you can't leave people with a concept of God that works really great in elementary school and then expect them to orient their lives as adults around a beautiful account of reality.
That's right. I think to some extent we've not the church leadership has not woken up to the fact that we don't live in the Middle Ages anymore, right? Once upon a time, it was fine for the laity to have theologically all kinds of like incoherent heretical beliefs. Who knows if that was ever acceptable, like morally, right? But still, like the church could survive while that was true. When people who weren't theologically very well educated just went to mass as often as they could and didn't particularly understand anything. That's not great, right? But the numbers didn't decline as a result of it. And we don't live in that world anymore, right? We now live in a world in which if we don't do our job of catechizing the laity, we will lose them because they don't have to come to church anymore. There's nothing that makes them do it. And so it's as if the theologians and leaders of the church have not come to realize that the times have changed in that way, right? Where the social reality has not changed, where it's still the case that people who like don't generally have like theology degrees or whatever, like do what is true now was true in the Middle Ages too, right? Most people were heretics, but the stakes were lower sociologically in the Middle Ages because it didn't matter that you were heretic, like you still went to mass every Sunday, blah blah blah. But that's not true anymore, and fail to equip people in our pews.
Yeah. So one of the questions I know people listening are going to ask me if I don't ask you is how you see and understand kind of the scientific research into contemplative practice and then both, what it looks like scientifically on the human side, and then how you understand its role in Christian spiritual formation.
Okay. So there are various research programs on contemplative practices. The most well known tend to involve neuroscience in some way. And so the typical study would be to hire a bunch of monks and get them to meditate while they're in an fMRI machine, and then we look at which part of their brain lights up, and we go, look, this is the part of the brain that lights up when they're meditating. Isn't that great? So that's kind of your prototypical like new scientist kind of study, which I think is very uninteresting scientifically, because of course some part of your brain is going to light up unless you have a good theory about why you should expect particular parts of your brain to light up. It's not very interesting, because like what else will light up, right? Like if you're a neuroscientist, the assumption is that the action is happening. There's some action happening in your brain. So let's sort of bracket that enterprise for a moment, right? It's the sort of like sensationalist, sexy and a bit tacky way to do neuroscience of religion. There is I think much more interesting work on the kind of psychological effects of these meditative practices. There's a lot of work on the effects of regular contemplative practice on physical and psychological well-being. There is now also some research on the risk factors. There are some people in the minority, but still there are some people for whom different kinds of contemplative and meditative practices trigger anxiety rather than reduce anxiety. Right. So I think that is worth flagging up and watching out for. Now, so these studies tend to be agnostic about the kind of normative or spiritual value of the practices. Right. What they care about are measurable outcomes. How does this benefit your health, either physical or mental? And I think people of different religious traditions can take that sort of thing on board, right? To the extent that we're interested in persons as wholes, right, in physical and mental health, then we should be interested in any kind of practice that improves our well-being in this way, right? And so in that sense, then the research on meditation of different kinds, I think, can be read in more or less the same way as research on whether or not red wine is good for you, whether or not chocolates are good for you, and how much exercise you should have. So that's one thing to say about this. I think the other thing to say about this is that Christians should worry a little bit about cultural exploitation. Mm-hmm. Right? there is a growing industry of mindfulness meditation, which by itself is fine, right? I think I'm neutral to positive on that kind of thing. But to the extent that Western Europeans and North Americans are profiteering from this industry, and to the extent that the places and peoples from which these traditions come are not benefiting, we have a moral problem as Christians, right? Because then that's just exploitation. So this doesn't answer your question, right, as it were, but I think it does, right? I think Christians worry about certain kinds of things. I want to say we should worry about other things in the adjacent areas. It's like we should worry about the moral, economic, and justice implications of these kinds of practices more than we worry about, is it spooky if we do quasi-Hindu things like in churches? I don't care about that. I do care about the right people benefiting from these industries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And so how in your kind of would you differentiate the religious practices that where the individual is engaged in very kind of conceptual visions of be it a story, or wrestling with a text, or like the Eucharist puts you in a community practice of a particular part of the story of Jesus or something like that, or the liturgy or whatever. How would you contrast those to something like centering prayer, where you are, as a Christian, cultivating a kind of a sacred silence to encounter kind of the God beyond conceptual frameworks and such?
Right. I mean, so there are always going to be two questions for any of these practices, and the first is, what are the effects on you as an individual? Right? Does it let's say work? Whatever your desired outcome is, right? So if by work you mean it makes you less anxious, if by work it makes you feel closer to God, like that's one set of questions that you're gonna want to ask, right? So and different things are bound to work for different people. I think this is a sort of platitude, which happens to be true.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there is other consideration, which is, to what extent are you participating in this as part of a tradition? And I think that that there are Christian practices that are more central to the Christian tradition, and there are Christian practices that are more peripheral. But of course, those things wax and wane, right? The Roman Catholics like praying the Rosary, but that's a medieval invention, right? Is that old enough for it to be a venerable tradition? Yeah, maybe, right? But and then centering prayer is arguably newer, right? Saying the Jesus prayer is arguably older. I think the mistake is if we're only asking the first question, right? If we're only asking the what you might think of as the consumerist question, does this work for me? And then that's where you end. Like, I do think that Christians should at least ask the question of how is this participating in a tradition and also our tradition, right? And I don't know if there is necessarily like a right or wrong answer to the question. Like, I just want the question to be raised so that people are not just thinking as religious consumers, but as participants in a community.
Mm-hmm. So how does your own self-understanding as a minister and as an intellectual and stuff that change the way you show up in the academy and in the life of the church? Like, when you're trying to connect the dots, how does it impact Jonathan's own self-understanding?
So I think so there's a sense in which the kind of holding together of my being a scientist and my being a priest affects other people a lot more than it affects me.
Mm-hmm.
I turn up to academic conferences in a dog collar and present work that could be presented by, like an atheist raised secular person, right? Here's an experiment I ran, and here are some graphs, and here are some regression analyses, and here are some beta weights and significance levels. Like someone who didn't wear a dog collar could present this, but but because I happen to look the way I do, I get a different set of questions, and people are intrigued in different ways, and so it affects them. I don't really think about the fact that I wear a dog collar anymore, because it's just the clothes I wear, right? Like, it represents a lot, right? But I'm not thinking about it all the time in that kind of way, and a similar thing is true the other way around, which is that like with churches and with religious people in general, I guess I do get treated differently, and I get asked different questions and asked to do different kinds of things, like give different kinds of talks, etc. When people know about the kind of work that I do in my day job, I think the only way it affects my kind of like day-to-day ministry life is that my preaching tends to involve like empirical facts from the social and natural sciences quite a lot, as a kind of as fodder for reflection alongside the biblical text. So Karl Barth, I think, at least there's a kind of anecdote about Karl Barth, about how he used to say that when you're writing a sermon, you should have a Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other. I've also seen this anecdote circulated with other people's names besides Karl Barth, so I don't actually know if any of this is true. But I guess I will have a newspaper in one hand, a Bible in the other hand, and a set of graphs in a third hand that grows out of my back or something like this. So that does affect my preaching. It also affects the way I do pastoral ministry, right? Like I'm quite an evidence kind of driven guy when it comes to what works for pastoral ministry. So I prepare people for marriage quite a lot, and so I delve quite deeply into the social science literature on healthy and unhealthy communication, on the predictors, the causal factors, and various predictors of marital satisfaction and success, the dissolution, and that comes into play a lot when I'm preparing people for marriage, and you can generalize that in various different directions. So I think I bring a kind of like empirical approach to pastoral work more than your sort of average priest might do. And then the other way around, I think the way that very close contact with religious people, including my own self, does shape the way I ask questions of other religious people when I do research on them, right? I think one of the problems with a lot of research on religion at the moment is that it's done by people who don't know anyone who's religious, or who have pushed it so far away that they can no longer really empathize, and therefore ask some incredibly stupid questions, and fail to be able to interpret the answers to these questions appropriately. So there are really thorny conceptual questions that I don't know if I know how to resolve, right? But questions like, what is a belief, right? What does it mean to believe something? How to make sense of people's inherent contradictions between different beliefs and the beliefs and the behaviors. I think that kind of thing is much more puzzling to someone who's not religious than someone who is religious, because we see it all the time, and we see it in our own lives. That there are things there are beliefs that we hold that are inconsistent. There are beliefs that we hold that vary in terms of what it means to believe something, right? Mm-hmm. That there's kind of nuance to what it means to hold a belief that I think is sometimes lost to people who are not themselves engaged in a religious practice themselves, or at least are quite far away from religious people and religious communities. I mean, this is less true for people who are quite good at ethnography. So anthropologists who have done their hard ethnographic work do tend to ask better questions than cognitive scientists who have basically the most religious person they met is their secular Jewish roommate, at Harvard. So it's a different kind of thing, right? It's a matter of exposure, I guess. I don't know if that's a matter of just being religious myself, or being exposed to lots of religious people who span spectrums of different kinds, thoughtful and less thoughtful, more or less devout, etc. And then I think the other thing to say about the relationship is that, as an experimental psychologist, and this is true if you are a neuroscientist, this is true if you are an economist or a sociologist, our liturgy of relating to human beings is of relating to them as cells in a spreadsheet, right? And that is inherently dehumanizing. Whether we like it or not, our everyday practice of engaging with other humans is through quantifiable data. And I think that to avoid the kind of dark aspects and implications of that kind of dehumanization, the fact that I spend a lot of time with flesh and blood humans who cry on my shoulder, and who break good news to me when the children are born or when they've just gotten engaged, that keeps me human, right? In a way that I think is extremely important. Like, I'm not sure I could do my job as a scientist if it weren't for the fact that another aspect of my life anchored me to what humans actually are, as opposed to cells in a spreadsheet. Now there are, I'm sure, many other ways to accomplish this, right? But this happens to be mine, and I cherish it for that reason.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. So maybe the last thing I wanted to ask about, and I know you've put a lot of different research in it, is the question of death. And
right.
So maybe you can both introduce your own research and such, but also then like how that helps you think through your role as a minister for those facing death and for families struggling in its wake.
Right. So in grad school, and I've never been able to escape from this line of research ever since, I worked on a theory called terror management theory. It's in many ways a completely crazy theory, and it comes from a cultural anthropologist whose name was Ernest Becker, who died in the 1970s, who wrote this really great, interesting, complicated, and like vexing book called The Denial of Death, which won him a posthumous Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction. And in this book, Ernest Becker expresses this theory that virtually all human activity and achievement motivated by an inherent knowledge of and fear of our own mortality, right? So why do people pursue science? Why do people want to have children? Why do people want to be wealthy and famous? Why do people want to do good? Ernest Becker would say, well, at some level, all those activities and achievements are motivated by our fear of death and our desire to achieve some kind of immortality, whether literal or symbolic. Mm-hmm. And since Becker wrote that book, psychologists have jumped on it and have run literally hundreds of experiments in which they get people to think about their own deaths for a few minutes, and they compare those people to other participants who are asked to contemplate some other anxiety-inducing phenomenon, like going to the dentist or giving a public lecture or something like this. And sometimes they'll compare these participants to participants who are just thinking about a neutral thing, like watching television or going shopping or something like this, right? So what you have is different people do different things. They're thinking about different things in their minds. And then you ask them questions about their values, or you ask them questions about their desires. And what you see across these hundreds and hundreds of studies is that the people who are contemplating their deaths are more likely to report nationalistic feelings, or a desire to consume, or a desire to be famous, or sometimes racially prejudicial attitudes, compared to people who were contemplating other kinds of anxiety-inducing activities, or contemplating benign, neutral things like watching television and going shopping. And so there does seem to be something going on, that when human beings, at least in the modern age, when we're confronted with the thought of our mortality, we begin to kind of act out in different ways. We want to become more conservative in a particular way. We begin to desire a way to live on, either in our groups, our cultures, our values, or in things like material wealth and social renown. And so that kind of work, that body of work, which is work that I participated in. I ran studies on the effects of thinking about death on people's religiosity in the moment. The extent to which in that given moment, whether or not they're more or less persuaded to be religious. So that's the kind of work that I did. But that broader research literature did make me think about the importance of reckoning with our mortality, because it seems like when we're confronted with it, act out in ways that are unsavory, in ways that are dehumanizing to other people. And so I became really interested in working out how, as Christians in Christian ministry, we can encourage people to kind of reckon with their deaths in more healthy and interesting ways. And this might be things like getting people to prepare more practically for death, but also things like death cafes. So I used to run and still occasionally run what are called death cafes, where strangers get together and we spend an hour or so just talking about different aspects of death and dying. It's not meant to be a bereavement group, but we might talk about people's afterlife beliefs, or about what you want for your funeral, and the notion of a good death if we're trying to be a bit fancier. And I do that as a means of getting people to engage with this idea that we are all mortal, and that we that at some level we have to accept this, even if the acceptance looks like protest, right? And I don't want to prejudge what accepting mortality looks like. I don't necessarily think that for everyone it has to be this sort of stoic acceptance that it's a quote unquote natural part of life, because at some level I think the Christian doctrine of death is that it's awful, right? Like it is an aberration. I like to say Jesus never met a dead guy he didn't bring back to life. And so I think it's not necessarily the case that I'm trying to promote a kind of stoic acceptance of death, but I do want us to engage with our mortality, in the hope that it doesn't lead to belligerent behavior when we're confronted with it.
Mm-hmm. No, that's really helpful. I like the idea of the death cafe. I could, because one of the challenges I think in ministry is figuring out ways to facilitate healthy conversations around topics outside of the moment of, extreme difficulty. Like on the worst day when they're in the hospital with bad news is not the time to have the first conversation about their funeral.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's awesome. And do you what goes through your mind when someone tells you and they don't know this is been a part of your research, and they say, "Hey, have you ever read The Denial of Death?"
Well, I don't think anyone's ever asked me that. In part because I think if people know anything about my work already, they'll kind of work it out that I know about this. But no, if someone doesn't know my work yet, like I will say yes, right? Like I'll say, look, it's a great book, it's very interesting. I wrote a paper about the book, and you can go and read it if you like. I'm happy to have a conversation. Like I think I'll be pretty keen on anyone who's read the book and wants to have an interesting conversation about it. It's a really interesting book. Like it's completely crazy in some ways, but like any book that has, Kierkegaard and Freud in it at the same time, and which is about death, that has to be kind of fascinating.
Oh yeah. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to join the podcast.
No, it was really good fun. Thanks for having me.